Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience and waiting for everyone to show up today. The first thing I wanted to talk about was to share a report that I created on the Indians of North America subject headings. I sent out a link to the full report in the agenda. So I'll just summarize my findings briefly. So changing these headings will be very complex if we were to try it because of all the variations and the subdivisions that utilize the term Indian for Native Americans. Although Canadian libraries and Indigenous peoples of Canada have made an effort to decolonize the catalog and the terms they call themselves, tribal nations and organizations created by the Indigenous peoples in the United States are still widely using the term American Indian and even Indian country. So I feel that it's best to follow the practices that are currently in use by Library of Congress until the Subject Analysis Committee produces a report on the best practices for updating the headings. Are there any questions on this report that I sent you? Since there's no questions, I'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Stop sharing my screen and switch to the wiki if we need to. So the next items on the agenda are to discuss the catalog wiki pages under review that we had begun to discuss at the last meeting. So one of those was the graphic novels and comics page. And we had removed the statement about the country of origin. And through our discussions in the listserv, I had just added the link to follow the page's guidelines on using one record versus separate records. Are there any other additions you think should be added in order to clarify the statement, or is just linking to the other page sufficient?
Under the manga section, when you read it, it's, the term manga originally meant Japanese material, and then it brings up the other things. And then it just says for Japanese manga, add the local genre heading. But does that mean for all those things that are in the paragraph above it? The American.
It says just for Japanese manga. So I think they just refer to the Japanese ones and not the other countries of origin that use that term.
Okay. All right, then.
Okay, so here's the page, graphic novels and comics. And the part that we were reviewing is just right here under one record versus separate records. And this list links to series versus set guidelines. Is there anything else that you think should be updated? Or should we accept this as it is?
Is the publication history note, is that national practice?
I'm not sure. Lynn wrote in chat that she thinks it's sufficient as it is. Oops. I'll have to look up the national practice on the publication history note. I'm not sure. At this point, it probably is not a national practice because RDA has really become open to catalog or interpretation. And it's really just anything goes at this point. So I would say it's probably not national practice. Well, there are no other comments, so I think we are okay to accept this as it is, and we can move on to the next topic. So next on the agenda is Homosaurus subject headings. So since the previous meeting, we continued to discuss the Homosaurus page via the listserv and had the Homosaurus training. So I updated the page with Jamie's suggestions to not use the equivalent Library of Congress subject headings terms when the words are in different orders and represent the same concept. So there are still today some issues to decide on. One of the ones that we left open at the end of the meeting was if CCS should follow the recommendation of Homosaurus to use only the genre headings and not add the literary form subdivisions from Library of Congress subject headings. So it's CCS's recommendation to follow the editorial board's guidelines and just use the genre headings and not add literary form headings to the subject headings. But it's up to Scrap to decide on what they would want to recommend. Do you have any thoughts on this? Is everyone okay with just accepting the guidelines as they are? Okay. Great, we got comments in the chat for accepting them as they are. So the next topic, Adrian proposed to add the queer and LGBTQ equivalent terms simultaneously. And the document that she created is linked to in the agenda. It's a spreadsheet listing the terms that are equivalent of each other. So I did spend some time researching the topic by speaking with members of the editorial board and librarians at other libraries that use Homosaurus. And I also discussed it with Deborah. We decided that CCS's recommendation is to follow the Homosaurus guidelines to apply queer as an identity within the hierarchy and not as a blanket term. However, this is up to Scrap to discuss and decide on. We did receive a comment on the issue. There is some concern from others about requiring both headings at the same time because Homosaurus is optional, and there are librarians that may be hesitant to add the terms to records if guidelines become too complex and are still unfamiliar with the terms. Another concern is that even though queer has become widely accepted, applying it to all headings or all records could make it difficult to search for the items that are specifically about the identity of queer and actually use it in the records. And because it would be added to everything. I did also speak to a librarian at Schaumburg who has been widely using Homosaurus and actually has been replacing Library of Congress subject headings with Homosaurus. She adds the queer genre headings as an umbrella term, but not the queer subject headings. She only adds the queer subject headings to represent an identity when it's mentioned in the description of the book. So that's another option to think about. So regardless of what you decide, I think it's still possible to add some guidelines to the handbook on how to handle the specific terms and when to decide to use queer or LGBTQ in case the scope notes are not as descriptive, but Homosaurus is adding more scope notes. It's something they still need to work on. So are there any thoughts on this?
Hi, this is Adrienne. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. As you can all probably tell by now, I feel very strongly about this. I put together that chart and I counted up what the equivalent terms would be, and there are less than 100 terms using the word queer that would also be that would be applied at the same time as another term, if that makes sense. So there are less than 100, which I think is reasonable. And you know, I just saw a book the other day where the author inside the book identified as gay, but the term queer was used in the summary. So I don't think, certainly there are people who are using queer as its own identity, but more and more it's being used as an umbrella term. And, you know, I can just tell you from personal experience, when I search for something relevant to my sexuality, I don't use the word lesbian because it will either give me porn or often something homophobic. So I and people like me have started using the word queer when we search for things, even if that's not necessarily the first word that we would use to describe ourselves. I'm open to feedback and answering questions, but I do feel very strongly about this.
Would anyone else like to share their thoughts on the topic?
Since the purpose of all this is to make it more inclusive and respectful, it might be a little extra work on our part, but I don't mind putting in a little extra work to make sure people feel comfortable with the terminology we're using. So I can respect Adrienne and follow what she's suggesting because we're trying to be more inclusive and more open.
I just the concern is too, but if the work is duplicative, maybe it won't, then nothing will get applied, but that's just, you know, concern as well. That people may be hesitant to do it if they have to duplicate the work, and then it's just another counterpoint. Not that I'm not for inclusivity at all, but I just, you know, I would rather have representation than people not doing it all because it's duplicative. So
Yeah, to that point, Victoria, and I understand that. There are actually a lot of, I don't know if a lot, but quite a few cases where using just the queer term would actually replace a lot of duplication. So for example, you can choose from bisexual identity, by gender identity, gay identity, gender identity, lesbian identity, pangender identity, and all of these, but there is no LGBTQ identity that I could find. Queer identity is a great umbrella term for all of those. There's another example. So like parents of queer people, there's parents of bisexual people, parents of cross-dressers, parents of gay men, parents of lesbian, parents of transgender people, and just including parents of queer people, that actually makes it much more concise. So in that case, we would only be using one term. So maybe, I don't know if that helps, but it does seem like there are cases where it would actually result in less work and less questioning on the part of the cataloger.
thank you.
And I'll just share another example because I think this is maybe even a better example. There's no term for men, parentheses, LGBTQ. So the cataloger then must choose from gay men, bisexual men, and trans men. And I think queer men is more concise and a better umbrella term if none of those or all of those, you know, if the cataloger is questioning how to be even more inclusive. It's just another example.
So a comment from Sandy in the chat: if we're using the terms Indigenous Americans for themselves, shouldn't we also be using the terms queer community uses for itself? So I would say yes. And the editorial board's opinion of Homosaurus would be to utilize the term queer if it's like mentioned like in the summary, or the author specifically identifies with queer if it's in the title, and then they would see that as using that within the hierarchy of identities.
I mean, I don't think that actually helps the cataloger make a decision, frankly, because as I've said before, there are plenty of people who use the word queer and another word. And for example, in the book that I was just looking at. I think the title was Dancing on Glass or Walking on Glass or something, where the author used multiple words to describe herself. And, you know, certainly there are people who use queer as its own identity, but Homosaurus itself, when members of the editorial board talk about it, they themselves use the word queer as an umbrella term. So I feel a little prickly about, you know, setting it aside as its own thing when that's just not how people use it.
How would you suggest handling a situation where someone doesn't want to use the term queer? So, like, for example, if a book was published on asexuality, and there are plenty of asexual people that identify as queer, but there are also asexual people who don't identify as queer.
I mean, I think we have to take into account the people who are going to search for that term. Our purpose is not to not offend people, it's to make things more findable.
Michelle asks, in that situation, couldn't we add multiple headings for multiple identities? So I would say yes, there can always be multiple headings for multiple identities, especially if it's mentioned and you can clearly identify what the identities are.
Maybe I missed something. Does Homosaurus provide an umbrella term?
So there are, if you look at that chart, I don't know how well I explained it, but in many cases, LGBTQ is used as an umbrella term, but not always. And I think we have to consider the fact that people are going to search queer just as much, if not more, as they're going to search LGBTQ. They get used interchangeably, and so I think we need to take that into consideration.
I have to say, I feel anecdotally like that is true. I feel like that's the term that I search for, that patrons who've come up to me search with just as frequently as LGBTQ. So I'm a little wary of setting it aside as well, I guess. I'm not quite sure what the best solution here would be.
Are there any other comments? Would someone like to make a motion?
Hi, Rachel.
Yes.
Before the motion, could you just clarify what exactly is being proposed?
Okay, so I would say that the proposal would be to include a statement on the catalog wiki recommending guidelines to apply the queer subject headings and genre headings at the same time as the LGBTQ equivalent headings.
Okay,
If
so
you-
anytime a heading was added that has the term LGBTQ in it, we would be required to add the related heading with the word queer in it. Is that basically it?
Am I understanding it correctly, Adrian?
Yeah, and again, if you just take a look at that chart, an example would be applying Christians, LGBTQ, and also queer Christians. Daughters, LGBTQ, queer daughters. And like I said, there's less than 100 of those where that would be the case.
And it would be, so it's recommended or required?
Well, Homosaurus is not required. It's being allowed. So it's really up to the librarian to decide to even add any Homosaurus terms. So I would say it's a recommendation because Homosaurus is not a requirement.
But I was hearing the proposal would be a requirement. So adding the headings at all is optional, but if we do use the headings, we would be required to add them a certain way. Isn't that what's being proposed?
I didn't understand it that way.
I think since
I thought it was a recommendation of how we would handle that if we are just choosing to do that. Maybe I'm wrong.
Right. I don't think I would want to say it's a requirement because Homosaurus is not required. I think at this point, if we make a motion, it would only be a motion to include statements on that page as guidelines.
Statements that are, so someone could add the headings as suggested, or they could not add them. Is that right?
Right. Adrian stated in the chat that she would consider it a best practice.
Okay, yeah, I think the thing holding me back from the whole thing was the idea that it is optional at all. So I didn't want to add a bunch of requirements that would dissuade people from adding them in the first place. And I know Adrian says, oh, it's just 100, but to me, 100 sounds like a lot of headings that the cataloger would have to remember. Okay, is this one that I need to add the other heading for? And I'd rather, find ways to encourage people to add the Homosaurus headings in general. And I think, like in Rachel's slide, I think simpler guidelines are easier and more likely to be followed. But if it's just a suggestion, I guess that would be fine with me.
Rachel,
So
would
if-
we, sorry, I was going to say, would, if this happened, would be including the list so people, if they needed to add both terms, that was easily available for them? Because if
That would be
things are
helpful.
available for them, they might be able to do it more
Yes.
readily.
Yes, we'll add a link to the list.
Okay, okay,
I don't
perfect.
want to make a whole table in the catalog wiki because it's extremely time consuming to set up because you can't just I guess we could.
Link is perfect.
Yeah, we could potentially try to do it eventually, but it's a lot of typing.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'd want to just add a link to a document.
It's a good idea.
But it's possible that both pages or both worksheets of the document could get confusing. So we might want to review it and see if we can condense it onto one page and make sure there aren't a lot of extra notes. I think there were some corrections because scope notes have been added to Homosaurus and will be added. So we probably don't want to make any like notes on scope notes within that document.
I think in the spreadsheet, just the tab LGBTQ to queer, I think just that sheet alone would be sufficient.
Okay.
The others were more just for you all and for convenience of looking at everything at the same time.
So I can recommend that if you want to make a motion to add it, that the statement would be to make a motion to recommend adding guidelines for the best practices for using the term queer and LGBTQ, and that the statement would say that you should add both headings at the same time using that document. I mean, that maybe you could come up with a more succinct motion statement, but that could be a good start.
Am I allowed to make a motion?
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm not hearing it from anybody else.
Can I just throw something out there real quick? Instead of having an actual list of all the headings, would it be possible to have just some statement like a guideline when you're adding a heading with the term LGBTQ in it, also consider an equivalent term with the word queer in it. And that might kind of succinctly say what we're trying to get at without having a big list.
I'm not opposed to that. I think that a statement like that is fine, but I think, catalogers being the precise people that we are, they might want to know what that equivalent term is. And I think providing a list, makes it easy. Of course, you don't have to use it, but I think having that list handy, I think it makes it easier personally.
Okay.
I think the list would be easier to identify the terms.
Yeah, because I think it's kind of daunting otherwise to go into the Homosaurus vocabulary and being like, okay, how do I find the equivalent term?
Are there any other comments? Adrian, would you like to make that motion?
Yes, I don't quite remember how you worded it, but I think I guess a motion to include the equivalent queer term when adding an LGBTQ term, or making that a best practice or a recommendation in the wiki.
I second that.
I think recommendation would be probably a better wording.
So should we write the motion as to include the equivalent queer term as with the LGBTQ term?
Maybe to include both LGBTQ and queer terms when there is an equivalent. I don't know. I know it's kind of a messy situation, and we want to be as succinct as possible.
When there is
I'm open to wordsmithing. That's
Okay.
fine.
So to include both the queer term and the LGBTQ term when there is an equivalent as a recommendation in the catalog wiki. Okay, and Lynn seconded it. 1 second. So I'm going to do a roll call vote. Tammy,
Yes.
John LaValle,
Yes.
Victoria.
Yes.
Okay, so Lynn and Adrian are yes. Lynn Crambier.
Yes.
Okay. Did Linda Kahn show up, or is she still absent? I think she is absent. Okay, the motion passed with 1 absence. Okay, Adrian, would you volunteer to write these statements that could be included in the wiki? We can't add it right now because we're still in the process of upgrading the wiki and it's getting really complex. So it'll be some time before I can actually edit the page. But in the
Yeah.
meantime, would
Absolutely.
you really? Okay, great. Okay, so next on our agenda is the bibliographic input standards page. So CCS would like to review the bibliographic input standards page on a regular basis, like every 3 years. So we're going to start that this year. I did mention it at the previous meeting and asked you to take some time to review it to see if there's anything you would recommend updating. One of the things we already decided on was that the, let me go to that page for a second so I can bring it up, was that the 945 field did not need to be added anymore. Is there anything else that anyone has found on this page that needs to be updated? And if you still need some more time, we can table it to another meeting. It's not something we have to discuss today. I don't have any comments or see anything in the chat. Oh, here's one thing in the chat. Life has been chaotic at Grace Lake. So since you may need some more time to look at it, we can just bring it up at the next meeting again and see if there's anything you found. And if there's nothing that needs to be updated by the end of the year, that's fine too. So let's move on to the next item on the agenda. The next items are new business. And so for catalog wiki pages for review, the first thing is a proposal to recommend that non-English language, that the non-English language is added to the 008 field for bilingual and multilingual books. This came from Adrian. I did put together a slide. One second. Okay, so I've done some research into it, and the issue is that it is difficult to identify bilingual and multilingual books in the pack when English is in the 008. The 008 is the field that is indexed as a facet and not the 041 field. And so this does cause problems when producing reports. I've noticed when trying to test our diversity audit dashboard, this will definitely be problematic in that it will not accurately represent what is bilingual or multilingual. And I ran a report and found that there are 89,027 bilingual and multilingual records that have English in the 008. So this is pretty significant. If we do decide to add this as a requirement, we could potentially do some bulk changes to identify the records that need correcting, but could take a significant amount of time with such a large amount of records. My main concern is that it could be difficult to identify which language of multilingual records should be in the 008 if there's like 3 or more languages, although sometimes multilingual books have different parts that are multilingual, and it might not be the main language, but might just be some words here and there, or like a summary that's in a different language. So a lot of records that are multilingual do have the code for multilingual in the 008. So that's also an option for multilingual books. Are there any thoughts? Sandy says using the non-English language in the 008 was Indian Trail's local practice when they were standalone. And Catherine wrote in the chat, what are the possibilities for changing the language index to use 041? This also affects patron filters in the pack, but changing the 008 seems to cause the opposite problem. I do not think Innovative would ever be interested in that. You could create an idea lab. You're welcome to try that. I think that if they did do it, the idea lab could state to include both the language in the 008 and 041 in the language facet and the index. But I'm not sure if they'd actually be interested in it. We'd definitely be able to do it locally to create a report of items that are in both fields. It's possible that Bob could figure out how to add both fields to the language facet in the data dashboard, but he hasn't had time to try that to see if it will work yet. And this would be added to the foreign language materials page.
Rachel, would using multilingual affect in the pack the same way for parallel editions that non-English language would?
If you use multilingual in the pack, that should appear in the facet with the term multilingual. And I think in Vega, it would not roll up if there were other editions that were just English. It would be a separate work record, I believe. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. It's been a while since I've cataloged multilingual works, but my experience with cataloging it has mostly been with like sheet music that has historical information in 3 or more languages. So in that case, I was always cataloging it as sheet music in the 008, so it would be the ZXX code. So I'm not familiar as much with what would be in public libraries that's multilingual. Does anyone have any experience with cataloging multilingual works to have any insight in whether it's easier to identify a specific language or to just code it as multilingual?
I was thinking about films, but
Okay. Well, with films, there's always like optional subtitles. Or do you mean like multilingual speech?
multilingual speech, so if
Okay.
there's instances of that where the film could be in, more than 2 languages.
I was watching a multilingual film recently that was from Africa, and English was the main language, clearly, but then they were randomly using 2 other African languages, like in incidental side conversations and like in the car and things like that while they were speaking casually. Like in that case, I would potentially choose English as the main language and couldn't necessarily choose like one of the other languages as being a dominant language. So would you recommend using English in the 008 or just saying multilingual in the 008?
Probably in that instance, English.
Yeah, I think the rule is to put the dominant language in the 008 And then for this proposal, it's just if English and another language are being used equally, would we put the non-English language in the 008?
So would it better to say that for multilingual items, if you cannot identify a dominant language, use multilingual?
I think we would have to be clear that we mean more than 2 languages in that case, because I think otherwise there's the potential that people would include multilingual when it was just a bilingual work.
Okay. Catherine said that they reshelved their multilingual films under the first language listed on the container. Are there any other comments? Would someone like to make a motion?
I'll make the motion. If we're cataloging a bilingual work, we put the non-English language in the 008, and if it has more than 2 languages and a dominant language can't be identified, we use multilingual.
I second that.
Was that Len Rubio? I was looking down and didn't see.
Yes.
Okay. One second. We're going to do a roll call vote.
Discussion?
Oh, yes, John?
What works are we talking about in this proposal?
Bilingual and multilingual works.
So are we talking about movies with dubbing?
No, I think with dubbing, you would code. I mean, if dubbing is an option, I think that's not the same thing as cataloging it as whatever the original language is, if that makes sense. So if it's an English movie, you would put English in the 008. If there's an option for dubbing, as there is with subtitles, you would include that in the 500 notes.
Okay, how about dictionaries?
I would say that if it's a Spanish English dictionary, you put Spanish in the 008.
Test books, learning a language.
Again, I think the idea is to make it easier to find the non-English language works, right? Since English is what makes up most of our collections.
Sure. I'm asking all these questions because I'm not clear exactly what things we're having trouble finding.
So if you think of like a picture book that's bilingual and it has text in, parallel text in both English and Spanish.
Okay.
A lot of times it will be coded as English in the 008, and you can't find it when you're looking for Spanish language books.
Okay. we would have a genre heading of bilingual books for that.
Yeah, but it wouldn't catch that it's a Spanish language bilingual book and not a Chinese language bilingual
Yeah,
book.
I'm just talking through this. Would there be a language in the uniform title? Okay. All right.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to do a roll call vote. Tammy,
Yes.
John,
No.
Victoria,
Yes.
Lynn,
Which one?
Lynn Cranbeer.
Yes.
And Linda is absent. Okay, Carrie is a yes from Brad. Is Brad voting as a proxy for Linda? Okay, so the motion passed. 7 yeses and 1 no. Okay, so Adrian, would you like to help write the text for that section for the catalog wiki?
Sure.
Great, thanks. So again, it'll take a while before we can actually edit the wiki to get it up, but we can work on the text, and I think we should send it out to the listserv for comments on how to write it when you're done, Adrian, and see if there's anything else to add. Okay, so the next thing on the agenda was the series title versus main title page. An issue came up recently about the description of how 490s should be traced. There was some confusion about the 490s that say in the authority record that they should not be traced. I did find quite a number of series in the CCS catalog that have that instance where the actual authority record says not to trace it, but we trace it anyway. And the suggestion or recommendation from Sandra was to add a statement including that the authorized access point for series that say they should not be traced in the records should be traced. Is anyone against adding that to the catalog wiki? I'll work on how to improve that statement.
If you find one of those series that says not to trace, we as an NACO library can declare nationally that we are going to trace it. So we should be updating the authority record.
Right, there are a lot of authority records that have not been updated, so we can't do that as a bulk change. So that would be like really time consuming for us to go through each of them and update it.
Right, but as you find them.
Right.
And many of them are pre-93. And since I brought this up at a meeting, the point of me bringing this up was new series are not being traced, and they should. I don't really care about a Borzai book being traced. If you don't trace it, you don't trace it, whatever. But new series should be traced, and that's the point of this discussion. We can certainly clear up the confusion with the old ones, but the point was for new things coming in.
I think part of the confusion though is like, if we should trace something like pre-1990s, it says not to trace it. Should that then be added to the catalog wiki?
As long as adding it to the wiki doesn't slope down or stop the process of fixing the authority records, I'm fine with it. I agree with it.
I have a record set of all of the headings that are not traced. So it has 1,283 authority records in it.
Good.
That have, so it's a lot of headings.
Well, if you don't want them traced, we can take the authority records out too. They can be, be out of the authority file. Then you're stuck with a lot of things that say they're unauthorized unless those are both changed into like 490Os or stuff, 330s or whatever.
Would someone want to look at the headings in this record set to review them? It's kind of a lot of work.
Yeah, there's Spencer is right.
I didn't hear what you said, Virginia. Can you repeat that?
Nothing. I was just reading the chat, and also it's also something to do with how the system works too. Authority records that say do not trace. When it comes into a system, the system automatically authorizes it, and it doesn't. There's no it's a difficult. They're difficult series to work with in any kind of, even our other Cersei, when we were on Cersei, it's a difficult situation because the system doesn't know when it comes, authority record comes into the system and says, oh, we can trace, we can authorize it because it's here, because it matches. But even though the authority record says you're not traced. So it's a difficult situation. I mean, how to handle it. The easiest way before, a long time ago, was I just took them out of the authority file. But also using Markai, they might bring it in, so it gets more complicated.
One of the examples that Sandy just posted is Wheeler large print hardcover series. It says do not give as a series nor as a quoted note. So in that case, I would even remove that authority record because we don't even need to add it as a 490. It should only be in like a 500 note if you really wanted to add it. And it doesn't even have to be added to the record.
Those aren't series, they're series
Right.
like phrases, so they're not covered under this discussion.
They are in a way because their authority records show up are probably in the authority file because they come in automatically, probably from archive or something, or things, and we don't catch them all the time.
So one example is like the Addison Wesley series in statistics. It was traced after 1990, but not traced before. Well, this is confusing because it says it was traced after 1990, but not before 1981. So in that case, would we want to still trace it? Oh, Sandy said that people do add it in OCLC all the time. And the authority record should be there for instruction purposes. There are a lot of people who add these headings to records, but I would recommend that you could still follow what it says in the authority record and delete it if you wanted to, if you catch it, since it's not really a series. So if we decide on updating the catalog wiki for this to add more details, I think it doesn't need to be voted on, I think, because it would just be adding more details to further explain what we're already doing. Sandy, are you referring to the Wheeler large print series still?
Hopefully my microphone is working. What John says is not the topic of this conversation, to me is exactly the topic of this conversation, because I see a lot of these series that have an authority record, but specifically saying the instructions not to trace or to give as a quoted note, but they're still being used as a series in Polaris by CCS. Because a lot of people are using them as a series in OCLC and not following the instruction not to trace or to give as a quoted note or whatever.
Does there maybe just need to be a reminder in the wiki to check the authority record for instructions? Maybe people are adding it without realizing it, that there's an instruction that says not to trace it. Would that be helpful?
From my understanding, I think your recommendation, Sandy, was to clarify that all series in the 4XX should be traced, even if it says not to trace it.
Well, my understanding from the email thread that we had was I was being told that if there is an authority record and it's got a 130, then we should be recording it in a 490 and an 8XX, even if the record says not to trace. And if that is the case, if that is CCS policy, then I think it should be clarified in the wiki that we should be ignoring the authority record instruction not to trace. If that's not true, and we should be following the instruction, then this is suddenly not an issue anymore. But I was told differently.
The Wheeler example is not a series, so it doesn't, it's not part of the, we're not saying trace Wheeler large print hardcover series because Library of Congress is calling it a series like phrase. Whether or not you want to trace series that have the N in the 640 whatever, I guess I don't really care. Again, it's about moving forward. Libraries are just not tracing series because the Library of Congress stopped and libraries in OCLC stopped, and we shouldn't stop.
And for a normal series, I'm not saying we should. I am only specifically and have always only specifically been talking about series with an established authority record with a specific instruction that says not to trace.
You mean the N in the 640 field?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so the question then, if I understand Sandy, is are we going to ignore that instruction or not? And if we're going to ignore it, we need to put it in the wiki, right?
Couldn't we
Yes.
just, sorry, couldn't we just send out a reminder to CATS that says, please trace series moving forward?
I think it still needs to be updated to say that if it still says to not trace it, CCS practice is to continue to trace.
If you don't want to trace a series from the 80s, that's fine. Someone else can come along and trace it or not. I don't think it matters. We can just leave it as it is, but just remind people that to trace series when it says to trace them. Yes, people still trace the Wheeler hardcover, and I don't know how, because you can't authorize it in OCLC. You can't authorize series like phrases in OCLC. That should be your clue.
Okay, what about adding a statement to the wiki that would say, even though Library of Congress has stopped tracing series, CCS continues to trace series?
It says that in so many words in the local practices table.
And that doesn't cover the circumstance of tracing things with an authority record that explicitly says not to trace, which is my one and only issue, the only one I've ever had. I don't know how else I can restate it.
Can I make a motion to include a statement on the wiki that says to ignore that's whatever the field was, 664, whatever it was. We just say that we're going to ignore it, put it on the wiki, and then that's that. Because it kind of seems like that's what we're doing. It seems like we're ignoring that instruction and we just need to state it so that everybody knows that that's what we're doing. Is that right?
I don't know if we need a motion for this if it's already been an accepted local practice, but we just need to add another sentence or two to clarify it. Because I do see what you mean in the local practices table, because it says to include it as a local practice, but that maybe we could just add further explanation to the page on series title versus main title. Or in that table on local practices, or both. Does that make sense?
Okay, I have a question about the authority records. You guys are talking about like in the 645, the subfield A, if it says T, it's traced. If it says N, it's not.
Right.
Am I understanding that correctly?
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so like I've got a new authority record for book 2, and the 645 is a trace, T for trace. So then I don't understand about the whole OCLC isn't tracing, whereas it's just somebody else that already traced it. I'm looking in LC, not in Polaris. And then the book, I know that there are authority records that I've found that do say do not trace. So I haven't. And I assume that was just because it was a publisher's statement, not a actual series statement. So I was understanding this to be when they say, if it says do not trace, it's just because it's a publisher's, not an actual series. So we would want something in Polaris saying don't trace that, if that's what we don't want. Am I confused on this whole thing?
I think the issue with LC not tracing is really that Library of Congress decided not to create any more authority records for series. And that if any other library wants to create an authority record saying to trace a series, they can do so.
Okay. It's just not LC created?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
LC hasn't been created in about 10 years.
Okay. Thank you. I'm not an MLS, I'm an LTA, so sometimes I don't understand quite everything. So I wanted to make sure I understood it. So as long as I find an authority record in LC for a series, I can go ahead and use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unless
Unless it says do not trace.
Mhm.
Okay.
And also up in the fixed fields, there is a little that says SEER in the fixed fields. It says SEER, SER. It will show if it's supposed to be traced or not. If it's an A, it means a traced. If it says other, I forget. I think it's an N for non-trace.
Okay.
That helps too if you remember to go up in the fixed fields.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, if this example helps any better, because this has been my bugaboo for a long time, even when we were standalone, the DAW book collectors, which has an instruction to trace items cataloged before July 23rd, 1993, but to not trace items cataloged after July 23rd, 1993. And yet, Polaris is full of records tracing DAW book collectors, for the last 20 years or whatever.
Okay, thank you.
So in this case of Sandy's example, would CCS still be tracing that series? And following the local practice to trace all series regardless of the instruction in the authority record. Let's see. There are some comments in the chat. Okay, so Jamie says this is already on the local practices summary page, but Sandy had originally asked only to clarify the language to add it at XX for all series in 490, regardless of tracing instructions in the authority record. Statements that are explicitly not series are not covered. Is everyone okay if I work on these statements to try to clarify it and provide some examples in email? Because it might be easier to read it rather than to discuss it, and then we can decide how to add additional clarifying statements in the email. Okay, we got some yeses. Okay, so it's 11 o'clock already. And the next thing we were going to do was to start reviewing the national practices category and decide if things need to be kept or just the national practices tag removed from it. Do we want to continue on with the meeting now or table it for another time? There are 13 pages on the national practices category.
Table it.
Table it. You may want to take some more time to review the pages for next week and look to see if you can find any local practices on the page specifically. Okay, we're going to table this. And so you'll have a little bit of homework, but it's just 13 pages. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss today, or should we adjourn the meeting?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Okay.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, the meeting is adjourned. And I'll contact you, Sandra, about the pages to ask you for suggestions and to get some clarification on what statements you think could be added where. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.